welcome everybody. My name is Catherine and I run Bristol Child Parent Support, and I offer sleep consultations and private therapy, workshops like this, and I'm thinking about doing some groups. So just so to know a bit about me, my background is in adult mental health, and I've worked in CAMHS as well, which is child and adolescent mental health, for 19, 20 years. I left the NHS just under 2 years ago to run a private practice. So really, and I'm a mum too, like you, but my children are grown up. So really these workshops, it was for lockdown to give a little, to be a bit generous, but they really incorporate my life's work and my experience as a mum. So there's a little bit of neuroscience, which I think is very important for parents to understand. So you can think, this is not about me or them, this is just their brain. I'm trained in 2 different sorts of parenting interventions. So there's some of that. And hopefully there's some practical ideas for you to take away. Okay, so today what we're going to be sharing is, hold on a minute, I'm just going to set up. We're going to be doing some brain facts because I think it's really important for you to understand your child's brain. We're going to understand a little bit about the fight, flight or freeze response. And the reason for that is it's key in tantrums and angers and meltdowns. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about lockdown because it's a scary time and your children might be feeling a little bit anxious, maybe having more tantrums and maybe having more meltdowns. And then some sort of brain parenting management techniques. And then at the end, if you want any questions, I'm going to meet you all and then we're going to do that. Okay, so let's get going. So the first thing in parenting, which is a tricky one, is to offer containment. And what I mean about that is that it's really thinking about how we understand each other emotionally. So when you're a parent, when your child has a feeling, it's thinking about what is that feeling and then giving that back to them. Most of us struggle with that because actually our children mostly can't, and I'll tell you why, can't actually say how they feel a lot of the time. And that's a brain development issue. The other thing is about developing reciprocity. So a lot of you here have got older children. So it's like a give and take in the relationship. And really what we're doing right now, we're kind of managing the uncertainty of being a parent. Parenting's so challenging. It's one of the most challenging things that you can do. And there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear. And right now in lockdown, there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know when we're going to come out of it. We don't know when the children are going back to school, although some of them might be at school right now. And more importantly, which we'll talk a little bit throughout the talk, is about providing physical and emotional limits and boundaries. So it's important to think about emotions, but not without limits and boundaries, because they're like the gates for children, not being over rigid and boundaried when they're in meltdowns or getting angry, but actually making sure it's flexy. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So I've really put parenting as a brain thing, and actually it is. So because children's brains are born undeveloped, so your child's brain is developing. It's born with about billions of neurons, which are a bit like circuits in a computer, and they need you to fire them because we're social beings. So it is about the relationship and it is about their environment. And so what this means in the moments of time when they're having a meltdown is that they've got limited ability to be reasoned with. They're not born with self-control. So that's why they go, can I go now? They don't want to wait. They get angry really quickly, or they might get anxious really quickly. They might, they run off, if they're in their sort of fight or flight response. And so they can't link their feelings and their thoughts and their behavior in the early years. So if you look at this, I'll talk a little bit more about this. So this is how the brain develops. First of all, children are born with this, which this is switched on, which is our kind of downstairs brain. So it's all the things in the brain stem, which are things like regulation, things like going to the toilet, thirst, hunger, all those sort of things. The second bit is the limbic brain. I'll talk a bit more about that. So that comes from like mammals. This is reptilian, primitive, because we come from animals. And the last bit, which is the important thing to remember in this talk, is that what develops last is the cortical brain. And that's what makes us human. So for a lot of you, some of your children, that part of their brain starts to come in at 5 and 6 and goes on until 24, 25. So to reassure you, you've got lots of time to make those connections in that higher brain. So I thought it would be really good to have a look at normal brain development. And what we're really interested in is what I was saying, the 1 to first, the midbrain is developing. 1 to 4, this limbic system develops, which is allowing them to start to understand social language, your relationship with them and empathy. 2 to 6, the cortex is developing. So that's gray matter. So that's those skills that I was talking about, how to control themselves, how to tell you how they feel, how to be able to manage emotions and feelings. Between 2 and 5, the connections are going fast. They're making a lot. From 7, it starts to slow down. And if you look at the different brains, I don't know if everybody can see it. If you look at this bit here, which is the blue bit, that's the cortical brain. And you can see as a child gets older, it gets bigger. And this is what in parenting, I'm really keen for parents to understand, because the higher those connections and the more connections made in that aspect of the brain, the more that your child can problem solve, manage their emotions, can think about emotions, can be empathic, can have memory and processing. So for people like me who've spent a lifetime in adult services and children's services with mental health, it's really important to develop these key areas. So because of that, children show their feelings through the behavior. Mostly before the age of 6 and 5, and actually older, they can't actually tell you what's wrong. Actually, they really don't know. So when you're talking to them about, why did you do that? Why? Actually, they probably don't know. So how you're going to understand what's wrong with them, and that's going back to containment, is they're going to have sleeping, difficulties, that's linked to anxiety, feeding and toilet difficulties with younger babies, separation anxiety and anxiety. Anxiety is shown through sore tummies and headaches and safety behaviors. And what I mean by that is a child needs you to do something, or they need to do something to make themselves feel safe. So that can be like at nighttime, they might need all their teddies in a row. And separation anxiety is normal, and so is nighttime fears. And the other thing that we're focusing on today is that they're going to show you how they are if they're having lots of anger, tantrums, meltdowns, and aggression. So something's going on. Tantrums I'll talk about tantrums, they're developmentally appropriate. Overactivity, your child might be wired, as I call it. So too much activity, hard to settle, hard to kind of, sit, or they might be a bit more withdrawn. And in lockdown, because it's a sort of unsafe, unknown situation, and they pick up our cues and their whole routines have changed. So some of your children aren't going to school, aren't going to nursery. These sorts of feelings are going to be accentuated in lockdown because of that. So the thing is about big feelings, which is hard for us and hard for them, is that we're hardwired for them. So that means that the sort of kind of template is already there in our brain. So we're hardwired for anger, we're hardwired for sadness, we're hardwired for fear, and we're hardwired for joy. So there's no other choice. You're going to express them. You are, and they are. A lot of parents I see feel very bad when they feel angry. It's okay. It's what we do with it that counts. And what we're trying to teach your children is talk it out rather than behave it out. They tell me what it is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but they can't stop themselves because of that downstairs brain. So if we think about the brain as upstairs, downstairs, it's helpful. So let's just focus on tantrums and meltdowns. And I know some of you have got older children, so tantrums are just storms of feeling, and they're perfectly normal. And actually, not all of them are about seeking power and control. So sometimes it's actually just because your child at the age of, 18 months, I mean, I know some babies have had starting tantrums, really early. It's just because they can't tell you how they feel. Because you remember going back to the beginning, they can't link, I feel this, okay, therefore I must be expressing this. And they're frightening, often for you and for them. But the important thing about tantrums is actually they're very important. So it's good to think about this if your child is having a massive one. They're key times for brain sculpting and assertion. So if your child isn't asserting themselves, it's not a great thing. And all of us will know that actually, if we struggle with asserting ourselves, sometimes it may be, something about our personality, but sometimes going back to childhood, that actually it wasn't okay to be angry, it wasn't accepted. So my rule of thumb is, as being a mum and working as a therapist, that all feelings are accepted, but we need to give limits. And the struggle in a lot in parenting is that we don't want to accept the anger, we don't want them to do it, but it's important that they express it, and they're hardwired for it. And what's the difference between a meltdown and a tantrum? So a meltdown is an extreme form. Normally your child will go from 0 to 100 in seconds, and you'll not always be aware of the trigger. Your child will be continued, it goes on a long time, and it will take a long time for your child to get back to sort of regulated state, good vagal tone. And generally meltdowns, I mean, there's no diagnosis, there's no sort of kind of diagnostic disorder about a meltdown, but it's normally with older children if they're kind of doing the same things as when they were younger. So it's often or not, I would say, past their developmental stage and age. So I know a lot of some of you've got 8, 10, 7-year-olds. If they're in these states, then I would call it a meltdown rather than a tantrum. So just going back to the brain, because what's really important, and I did a brain changing one, so I did last week, this is the last of the 3, is that there's a key area in our brains that's concerned with anger, fight and flight response, and freeze. And so it's called the amygdala. And if you kind of look on my diagram, there's actually 2 of them, but often I just say there's 1. And it's like there's 2 almond-shaped things in our brain. And it's basically goes back to caveman times. So when we were kind of trying to fight wolves, we'd either think, hey, I'm going to fight you, wolf. I'm going to, try and eat you or whatever, or I'm going to run off. I'm going to freeze. So freeze is important too, because that's the sort of real panic shutdown stage. And our amygdala is like a guard dog. So it's online from birth, and it's how we approach something. So it's our threat response and how we step back. So you've got an amygdala and your child has got an amygdala. So sometimes, what goes on between you is important. And in this state, we get it happens in 1/10 of a second. It's a fast response, because to keep us safe, basically, to keep us alive. That's what it's about. And it means for you, what I was going back to, and your child, is that there's going to be a lot of adrenaline, which comes from our adrenal glands, and cortisol, which is the stress, I'm sure all of you have heard of it. It's the stress hormone. And it's not good to have a lot of cortisol. Sometimes it's really good to get us going. I had a bit of cortisol this morning because I was a bit anxious, a bit of an adrenaline, but that's okay because it's helping me to get going. So here's the amygdala. So it's helpful with your children, if they're older, to tell them about it. This is just your brain. So it's very sensitive to gaze. So, because it's switched on from a baby. So when you think your child's not, and I'll go on to triggers a bit more, but when you think your child's not having a trigger, it might be the way that you look at them. All humans, because we're social creatures, are very kind of focused on eyes. That's why I find these a bit difficult, because, I can't really see people much. And it's also important because the amygdala has sensors in it for the calm down chemical, which is called oxytocin. So I know one of you was breastfeeding, so it's the love hormone. So I'll talk about how to help your child evoke oxytocin if it's hard for them to calm down. So here's some tantrum triggers. So you all know that there's tiredness and hunger. everybody knows that if your child is tired and hungry, and children need a lot of fuel, and some are grazers and some are eat. So, make sure that you're helping them to be regulated with food, that downstairs brain. Sleep loss, I'm mad about sleep and everybody getting a good sleep, because it stops the connections, the cognitive connections, but it also intensifies negative emotions and also causes an imbalance in insulin levels. So if your child has got sleep problems, then they may crave more sugar. Those children, and also sugar and eating evokes oxytocin. So that's why a lot of people can be overweight, because actually they're trying to help themselves calm. Because when we eat, there's other things as well. And so if your child's blood sugar falls, then they're going to release more adrenaline and cortisol. So you're going to get this fizzy child and then fizzy child. Okay, so if you're going to give your kid, chocolate's okay, but everything in or sweets in limitation, really. The other sort of tantrums and triggers, I'll go on to meltdowns and anger, is as I've explained, an undeveloped emotional brain, simply because they can't tell you how they feel. And this is from Margot Sunderland, who I trained with, which I really like the book. She was my trainer a long time ago. What Every Parent Needs to Know. I think it's a really good book. So psychological hungers are, a lot of children get bored. And so boredom brings on tantrums and meltdowns and anger, because children have got a seeking brain that wants to connect and wants to do things. So if they're bored, they might have an angry sort of tantrum. Recognition. So if your child isn't being seen, or we're too busy, and of course in lockdown, we might be managing a lot of things, like we're managing work, we're managing the kids, we're trying to balance it out. People are working from home. So that may be an issue. I'll talk about special time, how to work with that. Structure. Children need structure, not kind of over structure. But if you think about it in meltdown, our structures have gone. So it's not surprising that, your children aren't at school. We're not, I work from home anyway, but we might not be going to work. So structure is going to be there. So in lockdown, try and have a kind of, we're in it sort of 10 weeks, I think it is now. Try and have a sort of a structure. Is this important? The other thing is temperament. When I do my other workshops, I talk quite a lot about this. If your child is temperament, reactive or non-reactive, there's much more. So a reactive temperament means that your child perhaps or your baby was much harder to get into routines. The feeding issues were difficult, in terms of trying to, soiling or those sorts of things, elimination were difficult. So if you've got a child with a temperament who's reactive, they're much more likely to trigger tantrums or be more scared. And the other thing is your stress. And because we're in a stressful time, our children, literally human babies die without parents. So they're so cued into us. And, my experience of children is that they're deep and they have a deep knowing. And I've spent a lot of time with children telling me things, and parents go, I just didn't realize they felt like that or knew that. So if you're feeling stressed in lockdown, that's okay. It's stressful. Talk about it and tell them it's not their fault, because, it isn't. For a meltdown, there may be, complicated, and I'll talk a little bit more, but quite often not. And for tantrums, giving your child a limit, saying no, and they might say no back. Sometimes separation, a parent leaving, or difficulty with the transitions, nighttime separations, sibling issues. A lot of children, there can be sibling rivalries, especially if a new baby comes along, and unfairness, injustice. And for other children, there may be underlying issues. So sometimes children who suffer from ADHD, so that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So it means that your child, normally, I did a lot of assessments in CAMS. You can kind of see it from quite early on. They might have problems sleeping, they might be more reactive, might be on the go. Not all children are like that. Anxiety, learning and processing issues. I've spent pretty much a lifetime with a lot of children who have had undiagnosed learning and processing issues. What I mean by that is that the processing, the memory in the brain, that upstairs brain, takes a long time to come on, and some children struggle. So if you're giving them instructions, they might really struggle to take them in. So if you're giving instructions to children, give a command once so they can absorb it. Speech and developmental delay as well. So if your child has a speech delay, they're much more likely to have more tantrums and meltdowns because they find it difficult to tell you the feeling or speak it out. I've done ASC, autistic spectrum disorders, trauma, birth trauma or trauma, low mood and sensory processing issues. So this is tantrums, not necessarily meltdowns. Margot Sunderland talked about 2 different sorts of tantrums, and you need to manage them differently. So one of them's, I call a distress tantrum. So when a child is in a distress tantrum, it feels like the whole world has fallen apart. So it may be that you've just changed a toy or they haven't had something and they're really crying, and you get the sort of feeling like they've collapsed inside. So with this tantrum, it's not the tantrum that you set boundaries or ignore them. It's really important to think about this because it's really, you need to reconnect with them and not separate out from them because it distresses them. So with this sort of tantrum, and you'll know which one is which, is that you want to be sensitive to them. You want, and I'll talk a little bit more about management of feelings. You want to accept their feelings and validate them and lovingly hold them. Some children struggle to be held because they're so out of control and fizzed up. So just stay with them. The other sort of tantrum is the Nero tantrum. And you can kind of get a feel that Nero was a king. So it's a bit like I want it and I want it now and you're going to give it to me. So you get that sense of, they're going to have a fight and a battle with you and they're going to go in. So you need to be really different with this tantrum. This is, you don't give in, you do ignore. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So you do ignore the Nero tantrum. You do set the limit, and I'll come a little bit back to that. So when your child is in distress for the distress tantrum or a meltdown, it's really important to not ask them why. That's the containment bit of working out, because most of you are really good at knowing what's wrong with your child. You're just a bit scared of saying it. So it's okay to go, well, maybe you might be feeling like this, or maybe you don't know. So it's just good to validate the feeling. Okay, you're really upset. Try not to say you'll feel better soon, because actually to your child who's in their downstairs brain, they're going to feel like their whole world has fallen apart. Saying don't worry, I mean, I'm sure you all had that, when people say don't worry and you are worried, it's a bit like an invalidation, isn't it? Try not to get anxious or angry too. And we'll talk a bit about how to manage your feelings. And if you ask why, they're not going to be able to tell you in either Nero or distress or meltdown, because their systems are overloaded. So a little bit more about managing Nero tantrums. If your child is kicking you or hurting themselves by banging or in a meltdown as well, it's always in parenting, you do safety first. Everything else comes later. So you help them to feel safe and the environment. So you don't stand there to be kicked or hit. I've got very strong feelings that children shouldn't be hitting their parents. It needs to be really clear, or destroying things. So we'll talk a little bit about how to manage those things. You need to have a conversation with them beforehand and have a clear plan. So ignore them, don't give in, don't reason with them. And this is really hard. I had a negotiator as a child who was really articulate. So in a way, you don't want to get into sort of ping pong chit chat with them. Remove yourself, be firm, give them information on what's appropriate. Okay, and think about your family rules. Like I've said, it's really important, safety first. That's the biggest rule. So I always think there's a bit of like a 5-step management plan. So what's really important with any of these things, tantrums and meltdowns, is teach your children about feelings and not just about worry. So they need to have a range of feelings: frustration, disappointment, joy, anger, you know, all of the emotions, sadness, you know, love. And they need to, the more that they can sort of feel into what happens to them in the feeling too. So ask them, what's going on inside? You know, they might feel hot because we get hot. That's why I put hot moments, because actually we get hot. You know, the upstairs brain is much more cooler, we say. So we're in our downstairs hot. When I say accept, it doesn't mean that you're accepting the behavior, but you're accepting the feeling. So separate out the feeling from the behavior. So you can accept them being angry, but you're not going to accept them hitting you or hitting their brother or sister or destroying something. You know, validate, and I'll give some more things, and then manage. Be consistent and have clear expectations. So every family's got their own house rules. And it's important to have them. You know, what are your rules? What are your expectations? And be clear with them. And then reconnect. So it's always important to reconnect with your child, whatever, because if we don't, it's a bit like we're holding on to a grudge against them. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, I thought I'd bring up some phrases that might help, because sometimes it's really hard to sort of know, you know, what to say. So things like, I'm angry and I still love you, but I can't allow you to hit your brother or sister. It's okay for you to say that you're angry or that you're a bit worried about that, and be in control of that. If you feel that you're having a blow up moment and your amygdala's going bang, what's good to do is to just give yourself, if you're flipping your lid, is to go, okay, I'm angry now. I'm going to take myself off as long as they're safe, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to deal with it with you. It's better to do that than to stand there and shout at them, because actually what you're teaching them is pause button. And that's what they need to do. They need to have a pause button. That's what they're learning to do, is pause from the emotions using the cooler, higher brain. I'll talk a little bit more about the fizzy. Things like, it looks like the anger is hot. I'm starting to get worried. You might do something you might regret. How can I help you to stay cool and calm? That's with older children. Using phrases like sometimes or some people, rather than you making me feel like this. You are making me angry. So to separate it out, it's called externalizing the issue. So talk about feelings as the anger, the sadness, things like, you know, in lockdown as well, a lot of parents are doing home teaching. So looks like you're having a tough time right now. Let's leave it and we'll work it out in 5 minutes. So give a pause. I hear you saying no, I understand you want to do differently. We've got some two choices. We can do this or that. So for little kids, it's good to give them two choices, this or that, because their brains are not going to take in 5. Another one is, I see you having a big reaction to, or you don't like the food because meal times are key times. So these are all things that you can say. When they're calm, and I've put 2 hours later, because if your child has had a massive tantrum or meltdown, basically their cortisol levels are going to be high. We've worked out, because we can test cortisol through saliva for 2 hours. Still be that high. You can say to them afterwards, and especially because a lot of you have got older children, so you'll be able to do it. A younger child, maybe not. But you can say, you know, what happened then? Who was that came out then? Because children naturally give you a name. It could be the angry monster or the whatever. And remember, it's just part of them. It's not the whole of them. So I've put, one of my clients called it a Mr. Fizzy. So it's good to give them a name to that part of them, even if they're anxious too, like the worry wobbler or something like that. And then say, you know, what can we do in those moments? And then when the Mr. Fizzy comes, you can go, hey, Mr. Fizzy's come. How can I help him? Do you know, this is what I'm going to do for Mr. Fizzy. And also tap into how they feel inside, because most children are quite in their bodies. So if they know they're getting hot, if they're getting sweaty, which is symptoms of the fight or flight response, the amygdala response, the guard dog. If they're feeling, you know, if they're anxious, they're going to be having butterflies or feeling a bit sick. So when you can say to them, when you start to feel like that, come and tell me. And the biggest thing is how to help your children self-soothe. So this is the task in life, is to, what we call, it's having good vagal tone. That vagal tone is this sort of, it's how we go back to our regulation state. So self-soothing ideas I've put is play and play and play, because play, I've just done a blog on play, and rough and tumble play is really important for children, not just boys, but rough and tumble play I put in my blog recently is children learn how to socialize in that. They learn where the boundary is. And it's especially important if you've got an active child. So they learn where to stop, where to push. Make a self-soothe box. So what I mean by that is that make a box, it comes from sort of DBT skills. Make a box with something that smells nice, something that feels nice, something that sound, some like a carrot or something that they can bite into to show their anger. And that's something that, you know, some families I've got, they carry around with them on holiday or different places because they know that they can do that. They might be too far gone. I've just said about a big feelings tent. I don't like time out as a person. I didn't do it with my kids, and I don't sort of teach it because a lot of children I work with are anxious. And so if you put them in their rooms, I'm not really sure what it teaches them. If they take themselves to their rooms, that's different. They're taking a pause. So I've got a big feelings tent or a calm down big feelings place in the home. So it's a place where everybody can go to calm down, to have big feelings. Make it nice with cushions and things like that. Helping your child calm down is massage, because massage helps oxytocin. There's a lot of good research on that. In between times, help massaging your child at night if they get fizzed up at night or during the day, just giving them a sort of a 5 minutes. If your child, you know, needs to move it out because they're very active, so you can say things like, okay, next time you get angry, let's try this. Let's jump up and down instead of, you know, like hitting the wall or throwing something. I've put be a turtle. So one of the things is teaching your child, and it's a bit like a kind of a yoga thing, to go into themselves, be a turtle and breathe. I've also put self-talk. So helping your child with Mr. Fizzy. Okay, what do we need to do with Mr. Fizzy? We need to tell Mr. Fizzy to calm down. Or a superhero. So if your child has got a particular superhero, a doll or stuff like that, you can actually get them to play it out with puppets, the different bits of them, and help them to talk to that bit of it. I can turn the volume down. I can calm down. I've also put about house rules. Some families I work with have a lot of rules and some don't have any at all, but they're kind of there. So what's really good to think about, if you're wanting your child to change their behavior, it's really important to give the rule with what you want to see. So instead of saying, you know, don't hit me, so you could say something like, the rule is speak out your feelings, hands by your side and your feet on your floor. Okay? Food stays in the kitchen. Seatbelts worn in the car. You know, if you've got a younger child, stay close. You know, if you've got a child that's running off, try, if you keep going don't commands, you're not really actually telling your children what they need to do. So remember that. It's really important, because they'll go, okay, yeah, I don't need to do that, but what do I need to do? So remember, give the mirror back to them. We've got mirror neurons, actually. Give it back to them. So speak out your feelings and work on one rule at a time. So have a family meeting. I'm keen on family meetings for older children. You can start about 4, and to talk about how you're all going to get on. How do you talk about emotions and feelings? How you can all be a team, especially right now in lockdown, because you're all together. So it's a really good time. You can go on my website. I've got a SoundCloud family meeting talk and also a blog. And so a little bit, you know, about you. So in lockdown, our amygdalas are going because it's uncertain and it feels unsafe. And, you know, some of us might be really worried, you know, about family being ill and things like that. So remember, they will pick up on our stress, and that's okay as long as you talk about it. You know, I'm a little bit stressed right now. This is a bit uncertain, isn't it? Everything's changed, hasn't it? Talk about it, because when you talk about it and you can go, it's not your fault, your children will talk back to you. So when you talk to children and you're giving them the communication, you're helping those connections in the cooler, higher brain, upstairs brain. And I always say, you know, just, it's really good to plan. You know, if you and your child are shouting at each other, it's okay, be compassionate, you know, with we're all going to express anger and worry. So always be compassionate with yourself and just say, you know, the next time that happens, like I said earlier, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to take a pause and then I'm going to come back in. So with anxious children, they need to know you're going to come back, or they get really scared because it's the separation anxiety. So always say it and then come back and then deal with it. Or get your partner, I don't know if you're on your own or not, to kind of manage it. And one thing that I've always told myself, I'm a bit of a meditator, is in the moment, this moment will pass. Always things pass. So lockdown's going to pass. So always remember, if you're really struggling, saying to yourself, you know what, this is going to pass. Give the presence, give the space, and know that it will always pass. And you're all doing your very best. So I've done a lot about sort of compassionate sort of parenting. So don't beat yourself up. Okay, that happened. Talk about it, try and change it. You know, if you're struggling and it's too much, then get some help. Okay, so I'm just going to put some concerns, and this is mainly for older children. So for children having tantrums, remember it's developmentally normal, but obviously if they're hurting themselves on a regular and self-harming, that's not great. If they're doing that, that's not. You need to be a bit more worried if your child is constantly responding to events in an extreme way. So not just lockdown, but in general. If they're reaching a high level of intensity of emotion quickly. So you notice it's like this all the time. I do work with parents sometimes, you know, it's meltdowns for an hour. If your child is taking a long time to regulate, to be calm. I mean, they're not at school right now, but if the behavior is impacting on home and school, if they're harming themselves or they're kicking you a lot or destroying things, or if they really struggle, and they will do, working out sort of causes and responses and the effect of the behavior. So hopefully none of your children, it's going to be like that. So we're coming to the end. So thank you for, listening to this. Remember, lockdown, you and your children are going to be having more issues. So be compassionate. And remember, when lockdown finishes, there's going to be some struggles with transitions for all of us. So it's really good to talk with your child about going back to school. If they struggle with transitions, talk to the teacher, do it gradedly, those sorts of things. Because actually, I know that everybody's going to feel probably quite tired when it all gets back to normal, because we're moving out of a period of, it could be 3 months and maybe more. I don't know if the children are going to go back to school in June. So they might be off school for 4 months. So it's really important to think about that and talk to them about it, and talk to the teacher if your children struggle with transitions and you know that they're going to have meltdowns. Okay, I'm going to be running a parent group in the autumn. This is the last one of the free ones, and I'll probably run some other ones. I'm going to run one on anxiety, but that's not going to be free. And if you're interested, let me know.